Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, Restoring the Holly Theater, Who and How with George Kramer, presented by Jackson County Library Services. I'm Megan and I'm an adult services librarian here at the Medford branch. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, the Kelma, and Lagawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the Indigenous people whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services.
I'm Larry Mullally. I'm happy to introduce our speaker today. And I'm speaking on behalf of the Southern Oregon Historical Society, which is the co-sponsor with the Jackson County Library Services of this series. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us once again George Kramer. George Kramer is an outstanding historical preservationist. He's been engaged in preservation of many theaters, including the Liberty Theater in North Bend, Egyptian Theater in Coos Bay, the Algier Theater in Lakeview, and the Cascade Theater in Reading, which probably makes him one of the greatest historians, preservationists on the West Coast. What do you think, George? Sure. I'm not sure what the competition is, but he definitely knows his territory. It's very exciting that he's talking today on the Holly Theater, Who and How, which is something that we've been all watching as it's maturing in recent years, and happy to have him here with us. So thank you, George.
Good afternoon. Hello, and thank you for coming. We got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to go kind of fast to hope that we have time at the end for conversation. Whoops, no, that's not right. Okay. Really quick overview. Holly was built in 1930 in the depths of the Great Depression. It was built by local money. Earl Fell was the contractor. John Niedermeyer provided the money. He was a dairyman. Most people think the building was designed by Frank Clark, which is true. The building was designed by Frank Clark. The interior was designed by a man named Carl F. Berg out of Seattle. It was the 100th theater he had designed. We'll talk some about that too. The Holly was 1,200 seats when it opened, biggest theater in Southern Oregon by a long shot, maybe too big. It struggled financially. By the 1960s, this is what I call its Darth Vader period. It had been abused. The sign had come down, the marquee had come down, the interior had been altered, and it fell into disrepair, closed in '86. The Holly is unusual in that it's what's called a single rake. So there's no balcony, there's no interior division. If you sit in the very top nosebleed seats, you have a clear view of the stage all the way down. The interior, Berg's conceit was that it was a trip to Vienna. I'm sorry. It was supposed to be a canal. You were supposed to be sitting in a gondola, and you're going by windows and apartments on either side. The seats are blue. The carpet was red. I don't know why. And all of the lights were designed so that they would create swirly patterns so that when you were sitting waiting for a show to start, it was like you were in water. It didn't really work. They never worked. But the poor man had designed 100 theaters, and I think he just sort of grabbed an idea and ran with it. In the 60s, everything got covered up with blue fabric. Some of you might remember it that way. That's how I remember it. The ceiling got dropped with a T-bar ceiling to sort of improve acoustics. I don't know what. And they covered over almost all of the stuff on the side, which I'll call the niches, the windows. And that was sort of the way it looked. Various people bought the building, had different ideas for it. One guy decided he was going to turn it into an interior office complex, sold off most of the parts that he could to make money. They stripped the niches. This one here is somebody bought, that's what we'll call that a window niche. You'll see them later. And that is actually some guy's video center. He put his TV in it and all that. The ceiling failed. The roof failed. The guy that owned it at that time didn't have the money to repair it. And so all of the ceiling tiles fell off and the roof truss cracked under the weight. JPR bought it in that condition. The interior was condemned. It didn't have occupancy. There were some storefronts on the first floor. And like we always do when we restore movie theaters, you start with the outside so people can see what you're doing and what you are capable of doing. Neon sign, neon marquee, all the exterior got restored in April 1912. Huge sign relighting with a countdown with the mayor. But nothing much had happened to the interior. Whatever happened, happened. COVID happened. The interior, you can see, has structural scaffolding at that point. That's what's holding up the roof. There was just junk everywhere and it was in poor shape. So 4 or 5 years ago, after, just as COVID was we were in the middle of COVID, money came in to restore the interior. And what I want to talk about today is how we restored the interior, because that's really what, to me at this point, is interesting. There were little clues, despite the poor condition of the building, all over, of what it looked like. There, the painted pilaster on the right, there were some of the original light fixtures still survived. In the bathrooms, under the linoleum, in the auditorium, under layers of carpet, there was the original carpet, what some people call the squid pattern. One of the gentlemen that had bought most of the interior, a Medford guy, I don't know what he was going to do with it, that the shell niche up at the top, that's sitting on his mantle in his house in East Medford. He was kind of an unusual guy, and I was negotiating for the project to try buy it from him, and he would never quite say what he wanted for it. And he was quirky enough that I was afraid to give him an offer because he would be insulted and burn everything or something. The way that it worked out, when he passed, his estate was handled by Wayne Liska, the auctioneer out of Grants Pass. And Mr. Liska, thank goodness, called us and said, I have all this stuff that I think came from your theater. Are you interested? And we literally took trucks of stuff down from Grants Pass. And when you're doing a theater restoration, the whole secret is to have one of everything. Because if you have one of everything, you can make more. And so that's what we did. The decision was, complicated project, going to go on for a long time, that we were going to find local people that could help us do this so that we didn't have to pay travel for, theater artists from New York or wherever to come in and replicate all this stuff. It wouldn't have been cost effective. And because it was built in the Depression, all of the stuff looked beautiful, but not if you look too close. And so Larry has a piece of this is actually a piece of the pipe niches, the trim, that I want to pass around. You can look at it. None of the woodwork in this building is hardwood. It's not real wood. It's all painted to look like wood. And that's an example, a sample that was done to paint a piece that we had to replicate. The millwork was done in White City by L&L Mid. We live in a town, in a community that can do woodwork. And local artists that I'll talk about painted that to faux grain it. And everything in the building, because it was the Depression, was done on the cheap which let us do it as cheap as we could. But it also meant that we didn't need to bring in, Renaissance level craftsmen. We could do it locally. So we had the homosote on the walls, which had all been damaged, designed to look like swirling waters. Homosote is an inexpensive material that predates drywall and was a good sound material for a theater. And so we had little pieces of the originals. We messed around with how to redo it. This is a very early example. The entire interior had to be scaffolded, partly to repair the truss, but also because the whole ceiling was gone and we need to put a new ceiling back in. Ceilings are important in theaters because of their sound value. There was the proscenium, which is the greenish part down at the bottom. That's the frame that goes around the stage. That's one of the only original interior finishes that remained in the building that was usable. We ended up having to touch it up. The rake, the sort of flowing waters flowing into the stage was all recreated. And the egg and dart on either side, we had a piece of that. And so we needed to figure out how to do all this. And so the craftspeople that did it, we had one of the light fixtures when we bought it, the auditorium chandeliers, there were 5 of them. There's 3 that are about 3 feet in diameter and one that's 5 feet in diameter. We had one of the 3-footers. You can see it, or we actually had 3 of the fixtures, but none, and the shades were in really bad shape. That's that lower left picture. GKA Lighting in Portland, J.R. Vanderberg is an incredibly talented guy, and he replicated the ones we didn't have and fixed the ones that we did, including making the new shades, and we recreated that printed pattern. We redid them with LED lighting rather than originally there were 3 different colors of incandescent bulbs in them on 3 different circuits, green, red, and blue, that they could wiggle to make it shimmer. Now it's all LEDs, LEDs going up, LEDs going down, an entire range of available colors and more efficient. And the bulbs don't have to be changed. I talked earlier about the window niches. That is the original top of the window niche in the upper right, which is one of the things we got from Grants Pass. It was formed out of pieces of wood with plaster castings on the front of it. The columns on the window niches had that really unusual capital with the little, what I call the holly rose or the proscenium rose. If you look at the building, it shows up all over, was part of the original design. And then there were the shields. Those are 2 of the 4 original columns coming back to us from Grants Pass. The other 2 are in Eugene, flanking some guy's TV. They were made out of plaster of Paris, weighed about 150 pounds apiece, and were incredibly damaged from having been removed from the wall, knocking around in storage, going to Grants Pass, coming back to Medford. And so they were chipped. At one point, we thought about trying to find a stock column that we could just buy. It's called a twisted rope column. Turncraft in White City is one of the largest manufacturers of wooden columns in America. They didn't really have anything that would work for us. They were going to be expensive. It wasn't a great solution. So we found Kevin Chrisman in Talent, who's a local artist, a very skilled guy. Kevin, in the left-hand corner, took that original capital and cast and carved the missing pieces. You can see where there's stuff that hasn't been painted. That's Kevin basically filling in the blanks, filling in the damage. Wrapping that repaired original column with a silicone mold, and then creating castings of those products. all of the missing pieces for the window niches, all of the missing pieces for the other cast elements of the building. We own the forms. We can make more of them. They're cast in a very lightweight polystyrene, and instead of them weighing 150 pounds or so, they weigh about 10. Which structurally, when you're hanging things over 1,000 people up on the wall, is a really good thing, okay? Andy Lang, sorry, we had one of those top arches. We needed another one. Andy could take very clear measured, he's from Talent also. He could take very measured drawings of what we had and replicate it. And that's what this is. Again, we had little pieces of all of this. We had one of everything. Most of this stuff came from Grants Pass. And it was sort of like a library where we could just go and measure how they did things or take castings of how they had done things. Probably the single best decision that got made through all of this was early on, there had been a very, very skilled painting group out of New York that specializes in theater work. They were the painters that had worked on the Cascade in Reading, which has this elaborate painted ceiling with a figure pouring water and all kinds of stuff. And they did a great job. And so the assumption was we would just go with them to do this. That decision would have required them flying back and forth across the country. And they charge a lot because that's just kind of who they are, right? I argued that I didn't think that the painting in this building was all that complicated. Let's see if we can find somebody local that wants to play and work with them. And I called several paint stores in Southern Oregon, told them what I wanted to do, got some names. And through that process, we got Maranatha Painting out of Grants Pass. The Emorys. Bob is the father, Joel and Tim are his sons, his daughter works there. It's a whole crew. And they were incredible. This is just them going through. That is the base of one of the pipe niches. You can see that they are painting it, the one that Andy Lang made. The middle is Tim Leslie, who was a sign painter. We'll talk more about Tim in a minute. And then on the far right is a finished painted pipe niche. And so in that one, when you go into the theater, and I hope you all do, and you're looking at the stage, there are two pipe niches. There's two of most of the niches, but there's two pipe niches that hang in the middle. One of them is entirely original and touched up, and the other is entirely new. And you can challenge yourselves to decide which one is which, because I'm not going to tell you. I told you we had to scaffold everything up. This is up on what we used to call the dance floor, which was basically a floor level, 60 feet in the air, 8 feet below the ceiling, because all of the ceiling had to be new because it had been missing. There were huge vents that were part of the original air conditioning system that had to be dropped when we put the new ceiling in. And this is BLD construction, Robbie and Brian, in the process of putting up, replacing the vents. And then on the back, you can see all kinds of sort of long wooden things. There's a beautiful cornice that runs the perimeter of the auditorium. This is a piece of the original cornice frieze down below me. All of that had to come down because we had to put a new ceiling in. The new ceiling is actually about 6 inches lower than the historic ceiling for a variety of reasons that I needn't go into, but it is. But everything had to come off. Those are pieces of the reconstructed and remade, in some cases, cornice in sections, mostly about 10 feet, that BLD will put back up, and they're getting ready for that. You can see where you can see the studs below the ceiling. That's where the cornice is going to go. The cornice is about in real life is about 32 inches tall. Here's the cornice, the original piece of the frieze. Test model in the middle, where we're trying to figure out how to put it up. It's actually got 16 pieces of molding, most of which were made by L&L in White City that we didn't have. That top, it's a weird thing in the corner, that was the test model. The interior, because the Holly had received money from the state of Oregon through the work of Sal Esquivel, former Representative Sal Esquivel, everything that happened in the auditorium was prevailing wage. And I don't know if you know what that means, but it basically adds 20% to the cost. And so there was a huge effort to make as much of the interior off-site because we wouldn't have to pay prevailing wage to install it. And so those 16 pieces of cornice were divided into two structures that nested together on site. So you have to put everything together on site. That little drawing in the corner is Al Sella from Outlier, who was one of the general contractors, and me trying to figure out how to take all those pieces and put them together so that we could install it. We needed some missing pieces. Maranatha, Tim Leslie repainted the missing pieces, just created them out of plywood and painted that pattern on them. Those are all of the 10-foot long units I told you that were pre-constructed off-site to save money, that got lifted up and loaded in through a former fire drawer up to the ceiling level. And then this middle picture is BLD putting it in. The ceiling, we only had a couple black and white photos, and none of the photos were very good. When JPR bought the building, because of the water damage, almost all of it was missing. We had little tiny pieces of some of the ceiling elements. So we had to put all those pieces together and come up with a design as to what the ceiling looked like. And then we needed to figure out how to build it. That dado that goes around the middle, that's actually a photo that we had, and then it's a long story. It didn't all get saved. Oregon Architecture, who were the architects on this project, created measured drawings of what that pattern looked like. They were cut into stencils by a company, stencils online, by a company in New Hampshire. And then Maranatha created frames that they could hold up and paint that pattern onto the ceiling. There were circles that go around the light fixtures. And then there was the inside frieze and the outside frieze, which has layers. All of that was done by hand, by Maranatha, working like this. There are balcony niches that are just these little recessed panels into the sidewalls. And they historically had cast iron balconies so that some person waving on the canal could not fall into the canal. Those were made out of stock materials that we bought, cast panels that we bought from a company called King Metal, if you're interested, that were fabricated by Ashland Forge, Denny DeBay, so that we would have those to install. The shell niches, which are one of my favorite parts. We had one shell niche when they bought the building. The other three came from that guy's living room and Grants Pass. They were in varying condition. Maranatha, but we could tell what the original colors were. So this is, on the left is what it looked like when we bought it. That's the middle is it going up. And then the right is when it's done. And again, looking at pictures and looking at the colors on the information we had, Maranatha recreated that pattern for the curve. Bill Burfield, the project manager, we had to build concession stands. The Holly did not have concession stands when it opened. There was a 1950s concession stand that had been added. Some of you might remember this really kind of weird circular concession stand that was on the opposite side of the lobby. None of that was exactly with the aesthetic we were going for. So, and the Holly now today has a main floor concession stand and an upper floor concession stand. Both of those had to be created out of whole cloth. And so we just made these up. The split turnings on the lower concession stand are based on the split turnings of the original ticket booth, which was removed in the 60s. The second floor is just what we call Holly Brown with some gold detail. It's just something to dress up an otherwise plain surface. In the pipe niches, there were fabric panels in the corners. The pipe niches, I was telling Larry earlier, when the Holly was built, they weren't quite sure talkies were a thing. And so they were keeping their options open. And if you're not going to do talkies, you need a pipe organ, but pipe organs are really expensive. So it was the Depression, why buy one? But they built 2 pipe niches to put all of the pipe organ works in. They just never filled them. And that wood spoke was original. That came back from Grants Pass too. And that we had one original piece of the blue fabric that fit in the corner above the spoke. Patty Grant, we found matching fabric. Patty does great work and crinkled it all up. And so those all got replaced. This is the whole history of the pipe niche. Because they didn't put pipes in it, they needed to fill it. They filled it with these kind of paintings that weren't terribly well done, and we only had one of them. You can see in the next picture over where we're talking about the crinkly blue, and then there was a red panel that below it. The decision was made that we didn't want to commission an artist to try repaint these things. And so a cost-effective, period-appropriate thing would be to take postcards from around the 1920s, 1930s of natural scenes in Southern Oregon, and we would blow those up. They're basically 10 feet wide and 11 feet tall. They're from my postcard collection. One of them is of Crater Lake, and the other is of Mount McLaughlin. And Big Signs FX took that little postcard from a high quality scan, blew it up to the size we needed it, and then they were stretched over frames. And so the far side is the finished pipe niche with the postcard, Patty's crinkly blue and the red, and the little piece that went around is that outside rim, faux painted. And if you looked at that, I hope you noticed that the edges were painted in sort of a terracotta. And those are the kinds of simple things you can do with paint that isn't very expensive, but totally adds to the effect and makes it look much richer. And everything about a theater is about creating a visual impression. In this case, without spending a lot of money and using local talent. So this is kind of what we started out with. It got worse than this because a lot of this had to come down for structure, all new electrical, all new plumbing, all new heating and cooling, etc. Lighting, modern lighting. This is what we ended up with. With the curtain, the blue curtain and the silver band and the tassels at top. I talked earlier about those vents. You can see those vents on the new ceiling. You can see the stencil. You can see all of the swirly patterns on the walls. One of the coolest things that happened on this, when Maranatha was painting the swirly patterns, they were doing it from all of that scaffolding. And so they never got to step back and really look at it because they'd fall. There's nowhere to step. They got into it. They're fun people. And so as we go into the theater now, and I hope when you are sitting in the theater waiting for a show to start, it's like looking at clouds. There's an owl you can see made out of the patterns. There's we all have different names for what we see, But it's sort of like I would like to think of kids going, oh, look, a dog. And this was opening night last month. All lit up, all made pretty with all the new stagecraft. None of this would have happened. I always tell people I do lots of theater work, as Larry pointed out. And the reality is that anybody can restore a historic movie theater. It's a function of time and money. In this particular case, I've never worked on a theater that was in quite this bad of condition. Usually they've stopped showing movies and some local group loves a theater, and they want to put on shows. This one, we had the seats were gone, the walls were gone, the ceiling was gone, the light fixtures were gone. There was that whole weird thing with the guy having parts of it in his living room. And so we were able to recreate this theater and do all of the work, subject to review by not only the state, but the federal government, because of the way it was the tax structure. There were tax credits that helped pay for some of this, and succeed. It was quite a long haul, longer than it ought to have been. But I think we now have 1,008 seats. It's still the largest theater in Southern Oregon, indoor theater in Southern Oregon, by a good long ways. And it hopefully will provide for a regular stream of quality live performance in Southern Oregon that will support the economy of downtown Medford, give us all a chance to see stuff we previously would have had to drive to Eugene or to Portland or Sacramento or Redding to see. And I don't know, I'm glad to not have to be dealing with it after 13 years of dealing with it. But it does my heart good. It's still, for me, is hard to go into the theater and remember that it's done. When I was pulling this, and for the grand opening, they did a little history thing. All of the early photos, some of which I showed here of the interior, none of them are in focus, which was really a problem when we were trying to replicate things. And it took me the longest time. I'm a pretty decent photographer. It took me the longest time to figure out why they weren't in focus. And when this was in its worst stage and the ceiling had failed and all of the homosode had fallen, there was insulation above the homosode. And when you would go into the building, there was forever stuff floating around, little pieces of insulation and dust and the debris of old buildings. If you don't know, they used to allow people to smoke in the theater. And so old buildings, if you've ever restored an old building, are just covered in this kind of like grime where you can't see it from people smoking in them for 50 years. My camera would pick up all that falling stuff and not know what to focus on. So anyway, so that is my quick overview of the restoration of the Holly and the wonderful people locally that made it happen. I hope if you have not been in the Holly, you will find a chance to do that, find a show that you want to go see. They'll probably give tours again. I don't know if they are now. Because if you've ever seen it before, especially if you ever saw it during its period in the wilderness, it's worth seeing.